Hi, this is Ted. Today I'm going to be talking about. First of all, let's bring up Martin Luther. Martin Luther, not Martin Luther King, Martin Luther, a German priest, Catholic priest, back in October 31st, 1517, wrote up. He had written it up already, but he nailed it to a door, a church door called the Wittenberg door now. But he nailed on that door 95 theses, 95 arguments against stuff that was being done in the Catholic Church. He was not attacking the Catholic Church per se, but saying this is what's wrong in our church. And today, well, actually back in January, less than 3 months after he realized that he had made false predictions about President Trump becoming the next president, Jeremiah Johnson published 10 theses, arguments about what's going wrong with the prophetic movement and other prophets. All right, what I'm going to say here, first of all, he does do an apology for doing all this stuff, as I'm not going to make excuses, implying like the other ones do. All right, I think this is good. And one of the things he does is he's looking inward at the movement, inward on himself, rather than outward and blaming everybody else. I'll give him kudos for that. Mark, check one. Good. Bad, in this whole introduction, before he gets into his 10 theses, he talks about God is going to raise up these prophets and stuff that are pure and holy. This is imagination, purely imagination. And if God were to raise up a few prophets today who are really in touch and really say only what's on God's heart and what's on God's thoughts, they would be so overwhelmed by the fake prophets talking out of their own imaginations and the types of prophets he's going to attack. So we've got this imaginary prophet that he seems to support, this imagination type of prophet that's going to be there, and he thinks a lot of them are going to be raised up. I am going to say, it's not going to happen. And even if a few somehow were raised up, they're going to be so covered up by the fake that they'll never be noticed. His first argument is that there's a pitfall in refusing wilderness training. I think he's based this on the model of Moses, Joseph, Jesus, and David. How they all had terrible times before they were ready to become the leaders that they were. And in his thinking, I think he likes to create kind of an image of this is going to be purifying and taking away the temptations of fame and the temptations of money and all this stuff. That's what you need to go through in order so that you might, as a Christian, be better able to handle. And he makes it sound like not only better able to handle, but you're going to be purified through that. Now, there's no doubt a sense of purification that takes place in our trials and problems that we face. But by no means does it completely purify us so that we're above temptation. Jesus, at the height of his ministry, was being tempted. So I don't buy his whole reasoning about that. Although I will say it's important for a Christian sometimes to be broken. Sometimes to, as James says, humble yourself in the sight of the Lord. Be afflicted, mourn, and weep. Let your laughter be turned to sorrow and your joy to heaviness. And if you humble yourself in the sight of the Lord, he will lift you up. There's time for that. But he does give too much credit to wilderness training as if it'll purge out everything. David's wilderness did not protect him from becoming an adulterer and a murderer. All right, there's a pitfall, he says. Number 2, there's a pitfall in profiling others. In profiling others, he uses the example of the priest and prophet Samuel, who comes to Jesse's sons to choose the next king because God told him to go there and the next king would come from his family. And Jesse sent everybody except David because David was the youngest. And Samuel, when he first saw the elder, he said, this got to be him, the oldest kid. He looks like a king. And he goes through all 6. And as everyone is passed before him, he says, they're not here. Is there somebody else? Well, there's David, but he's out there with the sheep. Go get him, because I'm not leaving until you get him and bring him here. And it turned out David was the one that God had chosen. Now, the argument made by Jeremiah is that we need to be like Samuel, who doesn't judge by appearance. And my argument is he did judge by appearance. Every part of him judged and said the oldest brother is the person. But God overrode that and overruled. And that's what I believe a prophet or even just a normal Christian needs to face. Sometimes God overrides our opinions and feelings, and that's a better message than we should be like Samuel in that he doesn't judge people, because he did. Next, there's a pitfall that he calls of sanctified psychic reading. In this particular case, he believes that psychic reading among the Christian prophets is just telling people what they want to hear. In the world of true psychic healing, that is a small part. You do have to make sure you tell people what they want to hear. But it goes far beyond that. There are other things that are very common among Christian psychics, should I call them? You would call them Christian prophets. All right, according to Jeremiah Johnson, reading back to people what they want to hear is a psychic reading. And this is partially true and only partially true. Psychics depend on something called the Barnum effect. I've talked about that in many videos before. Christian prophets do the same. They use the Barnum effect without realizing what they're doing. I don't think most of them are realizing. There might be a few. There are generalizations. Generalizations are easy to get out from under. You give a generalization, and when you look back, you say, see, I was right, even if you're anywhere near what that generalization said. Hindsight bias. Believe me, these prophets are loaded with hindsight bias. What is hindsight bias? This is something taken from the secular community as they try to predict stocks or predict this or that, sports and whatever. Most people predicting these things believe that they are incredibly accurate, far more accurate than they really are. And here's an interesting fact. The people who like those and read those people who claim to be so good at prophesying while predicting stuff in the future, their followers will even more so support these people are always right. When in fact, if you look carefully, which some people have done, they look carefully at the predictions that they made, and they find they weren't so accurate after all. But for some reason, the followers and the very predictors themselves tend to believe that they're far more accurate than they really are. Generalizations, hindsight bias, telling people not to marry, feeding people's obsession for fortune telling. That's what's going on here. These prophets exist because people are obsessed with fortune telling, and they don't want to do it in the secular world. They'll do it when you can say God, include God's name on it. Then it's okay. They are no different than the fortune tellers in the vast majority of the times. And furthermore, they're looking to prophets more than they're looking to the Bible. The pitfall of Mammon. I have no qualms with this. He believes that some of his fellow prophets, even big-name prophets, are doing this for money. And I think there's only one bigger sin, and that is passing on these psychic readings and imaginary futures in the name of God. Number 5, the pitfall of the Lone Ranger. This one's a real steep one. He basically believes that prophets need more accountability, and more community, working with the community. And I would agree with them on that. Everybody needs community and all that kind of stuff. But I'm going to read to you what I thought about this. Accountability and transparency are critical. The word submission, which he does bring up, raises a red flag. It's scattered throughout. It's permeates the charismatic movement. And it comes from way back at even perhaps before, but definitely during the shepherding movement back in the 1980s. The charismatic community is known for discipleship. Caught onto this today. I had an aha moment. Discipleship, what makes good and what makes healthy and versus the bad discipleship. Micromanaging, that's the word. Okay, when you micromanage other people's spiritual life, that's terrible. It's dangerous. It's wrong. And that's what most of these groups do. The pitfall of pride. Well, who wouldn't go along with that? This fits everybody. There's a pitfall of pride. But here's how he mentions. The truth is that prophets need their 4 ministries to help them out. 4 other ministries: apostles, teachers, pastors, and evangelists. Well, this says a lot about his whole theology. But I'm going to move on. Giving oneself such titles, such as prophet, pastors, and evangelists, apostles, whatever, it reeks of pride. The ministries are biblical. However, as they developed and have been defined and as they've been practiced in the charismatic church, it's scary. Pitfall of adrenaline and emotionalism. He's catching on to something. He's really close in a lot of areas. In this one, he says, Jeremiah lived in a day when people actually loved false prophecy. Well, we do today. Believe me, the reason the whole prophetic movement is so popular is not because God is calling these people. It's because people want this psychic reading. I'll get into this a little bit more later, but there's a certain sense people want control in a very chaotic world. And prophets give them that sense of control, the sense of purpose, a sense of there is a future that'll be okay. And there's other reasons as well. In this process, they will blind themselves to whether these prophetic voices even have a history of accuracy. They don't have a history of accuracy, and I've already talked about that. Addiction to prophecy. This is my comment now. Addiction to prophecy is a real phenomenon, just like addiction to psychic readings or horoscopes. They come from the same human needs and feelings one gets from such things. Jeremiah Johnson is not far off on this, but as for blinding oneself from the history of accuracy of any so-called prophet of today is misleading. Most, if not all, prophets believe they are very accurate, and I've talked about that as well in that hindsight bias. Furthermore, if we really wanted to sift out and see how accurate somebody is, it is a huge task. For one, you're going to have to resurrect thousands of prophecies, somehow find all the prophecies that were said by these people, and sift out the generalizations, all the ambiguity, and then compare the few remaining. And believe me, there's just going to be a few remaining, unless it's about Trump. That was very clear. And that clearly shows you that they were not right, and that they are not right, and why somebody would trust them after that. This is huge. How can you trust somebody who's been so wrong about Trump and think he's going to be right about your life? I don't get it. All right, so use a little bit of logic, okay? God gave you a brain for a reason. He doesn't give you a brain to say, put it aside and just trust the prophet. That's just horrendous. To get to the truth, one would have to resurrect thousands of prophecies, sift through the generalizations, sift through the ambiguity, move them out, and then compare the few remaining, and then build up a statistic Excel spreadsheet and say, okay, they were right about 5 things, they were wrong about 10 things. Okay, they were right about 5 things, they were wrong about 5 things. Oh, that's pretty good. I'll follow him. No. enough said. Just about every so-called prophet was wrong about the election, but the prophets come out unscathed. Why? True believers do not care about accuracy. In reality, they will use and say things they've been accurate. They haven't been accurate, and they will not be able to tell you how accurate they have because they don't really know. They're just passing on what they hear from others. They're looking for something else, though. Because even if they are found out that they're not all that accurate, they'd still go to them. Why? There's a sense of control in a chaotic world, as I've mentioned. It might be that. It might be the feeling that they get believing and hearing directly from God. Single out. Oh, it just makes me feel so good. I get it. Whatever the reason, these things become far more important than accuracy. It is foolish request to ask a true believer to look for accuracy in what they believe. It sounds great, and this is something that Jeremiah Johnson is doing. You got to look for accuracy. It sounds good. It sounds really, really good, but it's an overwhelming task that nobody's going to do. So it's really not going to go anywhere. The pitfall of giving horoscope prophecy, a modern-day phenomenon. The increase of explosion of general and vague prophetic words. I've actually mentioned that. Jeremiah, you're getting close to some good stuff. There's so much more to the prophetic movement than promising anyone and everyone upgrades, breakthrough, financial blessing, and more glory. That's good. Now, he's tapped right in to some of the dominant themes that these prophets are giving you. Second, these prophecies do not ask for participation, sacrifice, or requirements. All right. There's a point to that. There's prophecy oftentimes calls, true prophecy from Scripture, stuff I have seen occasions. It has called people to repentance. It has called people to turn their life around and walk with God. But he calls this kind of pleasing people horoscope prophecy. He tapped into this also when he was talking about psychic prophecy. There's so much more to the prophetic movement than promising everyone upgrades, breakthrough, financial blessing, and more glory. Angel feathers, gold dust, property, and more. You can see where he's going. He doesn't like a lot of his fellow prophets. But he still has this image that there's this great movement of prophets on the rise. All right, God is raising up a company of prophetic messengers, intercessors, and saints who are hungry for the word of the Lord that has weight, substance, and specifics. I'm kind of half with him on some of the stuff, but I don't buy the fact that God is raising up this big army of prophets at all. Why? Because people aren't looking for that, number one. They're looking for the psychic prophets that Jeremiah calls, or the, what is he called, the horoscope prophets. All right, number 9, the pitfall of becoming a vending machine. He's going after a lot of his fellow prophets. The kind that has to come up with prophecies every year, or every week, every month. He says, okay, you might not get all the YouTube that you want if you don't give out everything every other minute. Oh, I think of most of the guys I've been dealing with. They all do this. Oh, I got a prophecy. Oh, the Lord showed me this. And all this kind of stuff over and over and over again. Ad nauseum. It's too much. I'm convinced that much of what fuels the pressure to put out a prophetic word every day, week, or month is the need to keep fans and followers happy. And you are right. I fear that many prophets on social media have built a following of people who are always itching to hear something new. Yes. Something sensational. Yes. Something entertaining and something pleasing to their flesh. He is not 100% wrong on everything, is he? He's gone after fellow prophets. He's also gone after the followers of these prophets. Now he suggests have the courage to remain silent when God has not spoken to you. I would agree. But the problem is they're going to be silent probably all the time. And commit to never promising or compromising the word of the Lord, no matter what open doors come your way. In other words, there might be an open door for a huge church or a huge following if I were to constantly give updates on the word of the Lord. I have nothing to critique in this. I'm going to agree with a lot of it, although there would be a lot of silence on the part of the prophets if they really waited for God to speak through them. I believe the entire movement would collapse. They would lose YouTube viewers, members in their churches, and the truth is the members in their churches are going to find the ones who will. If they stop and get things right with God and only say what God tells them to in the prophet type of way, their members are just going to leave and find somebody else who tell them what they want to hear. Number 10, the pitfall of carrying rejection. To be called as a prophet of the Lord is to share and partake in the sufferings of Christ. Well, we all are as Christians, but yes, one of those sufferings is a cup to drink that cannot be passed on, is the cup of rejection. I think back to Timothy, who in 1 Timothy, when I believe it was 1 Timothy, when Paul wrote and said, no, it's Peter. All right. And he's talking to servants. He says, you work hard for God, and if you suffer for doing good, you're like Christ. He compares them to what Jesus went through. But if you suffer for doing wrong, bear with it. Hang in there. I've seen so many Christians say, oh, I'm being persecuted, when in reality it has nothing to do with them being Christian. It has something to do with them breaking the law or becoming total jerks. And this is not appropriate, okay? And a lot of these prophets are suffering rejection not for Christ. They are because they're being total jerks. Bye, this is Ted.